Is that working? Ah, yeah, there you go. Hey. Okay, so for the benefit of people listening to the recording, we'll start with Judith Butler's ideas and then think about the practical applications of them to our own individual lives as day-to-day citizens, and also how they apply to social institutions, which is really what both Judith Butler and Achille Mbembe are interested in. It's not so much what you or I get up to, it's more how social institutions and organisations and governments, particularly government, how they run. And we'll link that to Mbembe's thoughts around the issue of necropolitics. That is Judith Butler, for once looking actually slightly happy. I say that because as you'll know from listening to her YouTube podcasts and things, she's a bit serious.
To say the least.
Indeed. She never seems to be having much fun when she's doing the lectures and things. It always looks like she's desperate to leave at any second. But she's still with us, still writing, still being very controversial and chipping in her 2 pennies worth to a whole range of subjects. Mostly what she writes about and became famous for are her views on gender. But that's a whole other ballgame, and we'll try and avoid that one later, because that tends to set people's backs up. Some of her views are quite controversial and very popular, but quite controversial. But instead of talking about her theories of gender, we'll talk about her ideas around grievable lives. And it does slightly overlap because she has this notion that she writes about a lot in her books and articles and things on gender, which she calls performativity, the capacity to perform. It's not something she developed as an idea, it was knocking around before her, but she's sort of taken it and run with it and really explored that idea in a lot of depth. And it's to the point where it's become very much associated with her. So when it's connected to gender, she puts forward the idea that we're all a little bit like actors on stage. Putting on a costume, leaving your house, going out into public is like an actor going on the stage. Yes, she's essentially building on Kaufman's ideas, but sort of linking them far more closely to gender issues than Kaufman ever did. So you can dress in a feminine fashion, you can dress in a masculine fashion. No matter what your actual biology is, you can dress in a way that you wish to be perceived as. Although, having mentioned Kaufman, he did highlight the fact that the way you want to be perceived and the way people actually perceive you isn't necessarily the same thing. So you might think you look glamorous and wonderful, and everybody else thinks you look awful, or vice versa. So you don't always succeed in having the impression that you wish to have on other people. So sometimes it goes horribly wrong. But the attempt is to convey, and she sees that sort of performance, not just in terms of clothing and hair, makeup, or if you're a man, a beard, facial hair, what have you, but also things like the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you behave, mannerisms, you use the whole body language system as part of a performance of gender in which you are making other people aware, whether you're a man or a woman, or these days, of course, we could add in gender neutral and gender queer and these other ideas that people have today that weren't terribly popular or even heard of 30 odd years ago. So this notion of putting on the show is something that she's very intrigued by. And that tips over into her ideas about grievability, because essentially what she's arguing is that there are 2 levels of grief. And this is something that she's influenced by a little bit by a German sociologist called Jürgen Habermas. He's very interested in the separation between the private world and the public world, between what you do in private and what you do in public. He's still with us, he's even older than she is. And he argues that the invention of social media and the internet has totally ripped down the wall between public and private. Once upon a time, your front door was the barrier between the private world and public world. What you did at home, with the door locked and curtain drawn, was one thing. What you did in the streets where other people could see you was wholly another thing. And I'm sure we've all met people who behave one way in public and a very, very different way when they're at home in private. So that kind of parallel lives idea. Habermas made the point that nowadays with internet technology, you can be at home with the curtains drawn and the door shut, theoretically in private, but you're going onto Facebook or Twitter or whatever and telling the entire world everything about your life. So even though you're in private, you're revealing probably way more to the public than you would if you were stood on the street corner. You wouldn't go on the street corner and shout the kinds of things at people that they tend to shout when they're on Twitter at each other.
Which seems street corners like.
Dodgier areas or something. So it's that notion that there is a blurring. What used to be a very clear-cut distinction between at home and outdoors is now quite confused. And we're still, he says the technology is so new, but we're still not really getting to grips with what's public and what's private. What should be said on the internet and what we should keep very quiet and keep to ourselves. What is acceptable to share, what is not acceptable to share. It's a bit of a minefield that we're all staggering through. And so she takes that idea of public and private, and Butler applies it to grief. So there are lives, or more to the point, I suppose, deaths, endings that occur, which could be an actual death, or it could be the end of a relationship, the end of a career, the end of whatever. Things that you may feel very upset about privately, but you cannot display that grief publicly. And equally the other way around. There may be things that you pretend to be upset about when you're in public, that privately you couldn't give a damn about. But you have to make a show of either being very upset or make a show of not being upset at all when you're out in private, out in public, because other people can witness that. And public these days, going back to Habermas, is not just when you're in the street, when you're in the supermarket, when you're at work. Public nowadays is when you're sitting on your social media accounts, even if you're on the sofa at home. The instant you go into cyberspace and start sharing your opinions, you are in public, even if physically you're at home. So it's opening up a new definition of where we grieve and what we are seen to grieve. And her interest is this idea that there are some people's lives that are considered definitely worth being upset about when they end, and other people's lives that are considered by the wider public, or possibly the authorities, bringing in government, judge dignitaries, celebrities, newspaper editors and journalists, anyone in a position of authority and clout. Some lives which people in authority may not consider to be worth shedding a tear over, or showing any public signs of being upset about. We'll stick to the issue of death rather than go off and talk about end of relationships and end of jobs, but you could apply the same ideas to any kind of a thing that comes to an end, and whether or not you're allowed to grieve the end of it and show that you're upset and distressed by it. That 2020 book there at the bottom of the slide is the one that she's obviously very recently written about this very subject. So all her previous books were mainly gender-based. This is the one where she's branching off into talking about other subjects aside from gender. Although she does manage to squeeze a bit of gender into this. We won't dwell too much on that one.
No, I'm doing nothing on that.
So this is the notion that grief is not just something you feel, it's something you perform. To a point, you could say there is a cultural performance of grief. In some parts of the world, if you go to a funeral, you dress in black. In other parts of the world, you might dress in a different colour or behave in a different way. So something like a popular fad in Japan at the moment is to hire professional mourners, who are women who dress in a very ancient fashions and clothes from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and they paint their faces up with a certain kind of, not quite like a geisha style, but it's a fashion in face paint that dates back hundreds and hundreds of years. And even though they don't know the person that's dead, they've probably never met them or anything, they are paid by the family to go along to the funeral and cry and tear their hair and weep and wail and throw themselves on the coffin and engage in displays of grief for someone that quite probably never ate. And it's considered rather poor show if you're a wealthy Japanese person and you don't hire someone to come and mourn at the funeral of your relative. The implication is that you didn't care enough about that person to hire a professional mourner. Now, obviously, in Britain, if you had to hire someone to cry at a funeral, you'd think that maybe that person who's dead is so unpopular, no one actually wants to cry, so you've got to pay someone to look upset. We wouldn't see it as a display of genuine grief. We would see it as very, very fake. Why are you having to pay someone to pretend to be upset? Is no one genuinely upset enough by the death of this person that they can shed real tears? So you've got to hire an actress to pretend to be upset. So we would interpret that public display of grief in Britain in a very, very different way to how it's understood in Japan. So there's the kind of the public element of grief. What clothing do you wear at a funeral? How do you behave? Do you scream and wail, or are you very quiet and dignified and hide your sniffles behind a handkerchief? What do you do? What kind of music is it acceptable to play at a funeral or at a cremation?
That's all changing, isn't it?
Oh,
It's not the kind of person you are.
Very much so. Things that would have been considered really tacky a few years ago are quite common to hear at funerals. Do you have an oration? Do you have a eulogy? If you do, who does it? Is it the husband, the wife, the children, the next door neighbour? Who is it that should engage in these things? So there's all that kind of cultural understanding of how you behave when someone dies. What do you actually do? Not just at the funeral itself, maybe afterwards. So in some cultures, it would be considered very inappropriate to get married, remarried, if your husband and wife dies, to get remarried within a certain period of time. So if you got married within a year or within 5 years or whatever it might be in their culture, you would be considered very callous and uncaring, that clearly you didn't love your late husband or your late wife because you've rushed out and got married already. And there's often a set, even though we don't have formal rules around that in Britain these days, we did in Victorian times, but obviously we don't have formal rules anymore. But if you heard that somebody buried their wife on Monday,
Hello. Darling, are you doing the Life Ungrieved?
yes,
This lovely lady has been round and round and round.
we had to move to find a computer.
Very hard. I thought it would be a lot more than this.
There's a few people online,
Okay.
so we've had to change classroom. Oh, anyway,
Right.
Yeah. We've been having computer problems this afternoon, which is why we've changed.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yes. I started off at the main college.
Oh, right.
So I've been walking around quite a bit.
Must be
Anyway, I told you up.
We've not lost the subject because of moving around so much.
Right.
So there's, if somebody's husband or wife died on a Monday and they were already dating somebody else on Friday and talking about marriage, you might think that's a bit quick. Even though there's no sort of formal social rules about it, it would seem tacky to be rushing out that quickly into another relationship. So there is still a sort of a subtle implied understanding that there should be a certain period of time in which you adjust to a death before you go out and start a new relationship, even though it's no longer as formally imposed now as it was in the Victorian era, where it was much more rigidly held to at least a year, if not considerably longer than a year. In a lot of cultures, widows will wear black for the rest of their lives. In other parts of the world, you only wear black for a week, or sometimes a day. So it's the notion of how you engage in grief in public. But Judith Butler is not as interested in the ceremonies and the rituals and the niceties of different societies as she is in the idea that public grief implies that the dead person was worth being upset about. The fact that they're dead is something people should mourn. And other people, when they're dead, perhaps don't warrant much grief. And it's the notion, what she's really arguing is that the way in which we value some lives and we don't value other lives at all as a society determines the level of sorrow that can be expressed when that life has come to an end. And she's exploring all of the kind of social norms and values and standards that surround that process that determines whose life is worthwhile and whose life can be ended without much thought. Mbembe, when we get onto him towards the end, he adds a sort of an additional level to what Judith Butler is arguing. He suggests that if a life, or usually an entire group of lives, an entire group of people, are deemed to be worth much less than others, that has a direct impact on social policy. Because governments and institutions have to make an effort to keep us all alive. They have to make sure we get medical care, that we get fed and watered, that we're not freezing to death on the streets. There's all sorts of things that governments do to keep their population alive. Or at least they do that to the members of the population they're concerned about. If there's a section of the population they really don't give a damn about, they won't make those efforts. And those people will just be left. The Mbembe's argument is that whilst it's not as bad as them rounding you up, putting you in a concentration camp and shooting you, nonetheless, if you're just left, the likelihood that you'll die quite a few years earlier than you otherwise would have done becomes significantly increased. So it's not quite like shooting someone, but it is basically abandoning them to die by not providing them with the services that would keep them alive. And even the most independent person is, to a large extent, reliant on the provision of services. It's not all about what you can do to keep yourself alive. It's about whether society makes certain services available to you, like healthcare and food and so forth. But we'll get on to him as we go along. So that's where she's coming from in terms of how she sort of envisions these issues, and then she delves into examples of different groups. She's a little bit she is quite on the hard left politically, and so she tends to tick the boxes that currently people who are on the hard left of politics like to tick when it comes to identifying which groups of people are most at risk of being abandoned to die. We don't have to stick with the group she talked about because her ideas can apply to a lot of other groups that don't tend to get talked about as much. But before I does anyone have any questions? Rather than me just rambling in there?
I haven't yet.
Is everyone at home okay, or are there any questions? No, I'll take that there's no questions. So to give examples of forms of public grieving, I'm not sure where that is with the image on the left with the car, but people obviously tied bunches of flowers, and there's, if you've got very good eyesight, you can just about see a few photographs tied to a lamppost, where someone has presumably either they've been run over or they've been killed in a car crash. It's quite common, I guess, in pretty most people have walked past or driven past somewhere like that that's got flowers and what have you.
Cambridge Road.
Yeah, there's a few spots in Ipswich where I walk the dog where somebody has died at some point in a traffic accident and the road is revisit and put up.
Especially at Christmas time, you can see all the fresh flowers put along there.
Absolutely, yes.
I think there was a point in London where you couldn't walk very far without going past a flower, particularly during the terror attacks on Westminster Bridge. That bit was covered in flowers. But yeah, London's quite bad for it as well, centre.
There's in Ipswich, there's a spot where a young man, two-ish years ago, something like that, was fished out of the river. Turned out he'd been murdered and held under, but no one knew that at the time. And the family had photographs and flowers and whatnot at the spot where he was pulled out of the river, rather than the spot where he was pushed in, but where the body was dragged out of the river. Thinking in London, certainly a number of cyclist support groups, or whatever the right word is, got into the habit of painting bicycles white, paint them white, and then tie them to railings at spots where a lot of cyclists have been killed and referred to as ghost bicycles. Well, partly it's a commemorative thing to remember someone who's been knocked off their bike and killed, but it's also used as almost like a warning sign to say to other bicyclists, this is a dangerous spot. There's something about the way the road is laid out or whatever, that there are a lot of accidents in this spot. And it's kind of the same function as the flowers, because there's a lot of evidence that people who drive past a spot where they can see the morning flowers tied to a lamppost will tend to slow down. Partly maybe they're having a look, but also maybe it's a consciousness that this is a dangerous place. And so we have to drive more carefully. There have been some councils that have put out pretend ghost bikes at places where they want the traffic to slow. Not that no one's died there, they just want the traffic to slow down there. So they're twigging that you can use signs of mourning and grief to manipulate behaviour.
Symbolising.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's a spontaneous expression. It's quite an interesting one if we're thinking more in terms of kind of cultural anthropology as much as anything else. Because obviously the tradition within Christianity, within Judaism and Islam and so on, is normally to go to the grave. Not to the spot where someone died, but to the spot where they're buried. And if you want to leave flowers or leave whatever, that's where you go and do it. So this shift to leaving the mementos at the place of death rather than the place of burial is quite unusual. It's a bit of a reversion to practices found in ancient Rome, where there were memorials left.
Do you think this is more community-based rather than the grave, which is more personal to family?
In a sense, yes. But most of the people leaving the flowers will be immediate relatives. I don't think you get too many strangers hanging the flowers. It's usually the immediate, the same people who live in the room. So it's a curious one. We could get more theological and think about the link between place of death as well as place of burial and why people are drawn to the place of death. Generally speaking, if your other half kills over with a heart attack in Tesco's, you don't tend to go to the frozen food aisle to leave it at the spot where they died in the supermarket. But the fact that this is maybe very graphic death, quite
it's a tragedy.
Yes, there is. It's a more shocking death to be killed by a car than to have a heart attack. It's even if the heart attack is sudden, it doesn't have quite the same shock value to it. So perhaps that is the element of the public grieving going on there. I don't know how my eyesight is bad, so I don't know how clear it is to everyone. The other photograph there is of Princess Diana in the flowery heart. And obviously that was taken years ago when she died, everyone was leaving mountains and mountains and mountains of flowers outside Buckingham Palace and various other places as a public expression of fairly spontaneous grief. Unusual again, because almost none of the people leaving the flowers had ever met her. So it wasn't grief for someone they knew in a meaningful sense, but the notion of celebrity and the grieving for public figures, as well as grieving for actual family and friends, it opens up a new dimension. I'm sure people hundreds of years ago, if monarchs, kings, queens, whatever died, there's undoubtedly an element of public mourning going on there, not just amongst the immediate family, but people in general. It seems to have accelerated, particularly since the death of Diana, and looking at the way people react to the death of actors and singers and famous celebrities of one sort or another. It's increasingly as if they're mourning an actual friend, as if they're mourning somebody they knew, even if the only contact they ever had was sitting on the TV screen. They never met them, and let's face it, had they met them, they might not like them very much. never meet you.
Yeah.
But that's kind of also something that interests Judith Butler, this idea of it's very, very acceptable to mourn certain people, like Princess Diana. Other figures are much less likely to attract bigger displays of public grief. And what motivates, because it did seem to be spontaneous, it wasn't pushed or coordinated by the family or by newspaper editors or anything like that. They just, people seemed to turn up off their own choice, rather than because they'd been herded to go and do it. Or maybe they heard their neighbours were going to do it and then they followed the neighbours up to London and joined in or whatever. But that sort of expression of grief for someone they had only the loosest of connections to. There were comments made at the time by newspaper pundits and what have you, that some people seemed far more upset by the death of Diana than by the death of some of their own family. In terms of weeping and sobbing, you're not just trying to put a bunch of flowers, but actually crying and seeming
Do you
to be
think
really
it's
genuine.
maybe because it was a sudden and the way that
Yes,
she died that impacted more?
I'm sure if she'd lived,
If it's a natural-
and, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe there would have been less overt display of the youth, the suddenness of it. Undoubtedly, the shock value contributed to a lot of people's reaction.
I can understand the public putting the mementos in where it actually happened.
Yeah.
Because you're not sort of putting a memento by the grave. What does
Yes.
that mean? It's just this happened here. I'm quite upset about it.
Absolutely. Commemorating spot. That tweet there is just as we talk about the death of Robin Williams in response to a question at the bottom there about which celebrity death has had the biggest shock to you. And that's the kind of not so much the putting of flowers, but the frequency on social media with which the death of celebrities is discussed. So-and-so has died, and then there's 3 dozen posts about how upset people are for their favourite actor, favourite writer, favourite singer, or whatever they may be, has died. Social media becomes a way of sharing a sense of shock, or at least Judith Butler would say performing shock, because she might question whether or how many of those people are genuinely upset and how many just think, oh, everyone else is posting about this, I better go and post about this as well. So how many of them are just jumping on a bandwagon of publicly displayed grief? And you usually get at least one person who mumbles and snarls about why you're bothering to mourn this person, they were rich, who cares? This is usually some bitter, jaded character from the other side of the fence. But maybe Robin Williams, because it was suicide, and that has quite a sort of a shock value to it. Especially when it's someone whose whole fame is built on being funny. They go and do the least funny thing, go in and kill themselves. That maybe adds to it. If it had been Leonard Cohen, maybe people say, what a surprise. So they might have had a different kind of reaction to it if it had been notoriously miserable and then killed himself. But because his grief was a very private one, not widely known to the public, perhaps that added to the shock value. I don't know if anyone's ever found themselves sharing shock at celebrity deaths. Or...
Right, well, I still remember the day that Diana died. I was in Malaysia at the time with my dad and the time difference, and I rang my mum up to tell her about what happened. She didn't believe me until she watched the news, and then, because I rang her in her time, 2 o'clock in the morning. So the shock value of her has always imprinted this in my head.
I was genuinely upset when Meatloaf died a few weeks ago.
Oh,
to be
yeah.
honest. Battle of Hell is like the best album of the 70s, when no one even says.
Were you sort of shocked enough to go and lay flowers?
It ruined my day, but I wouldn't have. The best thing that happened from it was that the radios were all playing Meatloaf songs. I know my mum remembers when Freddie Mercury died.
Oh, yes, that's like my best
They
friend.
played loads.
School. Oh, she was devastated. Absolutely devastated.
Yeah.
Mm.
So
I've never gone to some of the people that you see, the Diana one's quite an odd one as well, because you still have Facebook groups dedicated to remembering the woman. It's like, move on.
And new stories coming out all the time that she wasn't really happy when she died. It's like, for God's sake, she died years ago, just get over it.
Yeah.
Her life is her life. God, leave her alone. She can't justify herself.
It gets to the point where some people get so worked up about celebrity death that it becomes cringeworthy. That it's like, okay, like.
Well, it's like actors in TV shows. We all know they're actors, but yet they take on their role as if it's reality.
Yeah.
And the sites that there was one that recently with Call the Midwife, there's an actress on there that's pregnant. We're in the 21st century. Do you know what I mean? It's if no actress could be pregnant, she shouldn't have been working, she should have took time off. And it's like, really?
But we do get very intrusive into the lives of celebrities.
It's just
That sense of ownership. It's an you could make the argument that social media is another public platform for expressing shock and sorrow. Not just for celebrities. If a neighbour, a friend dies, people frequently create online memorials with lots of photographs and favourite music of that person being played over it, so you can go and look at a sort of virtual shrine almost to that person and share memories of them. That becomes a phenomenon in itself. There's a whole issue which isn't too much of interest to Judith Butler, so I'll just very briefly mention it, of online curating. What happens to your if you've got websites and a Twitter account and a Facebook account, this, that, the other, what happens to all of that when you're dead? Because nobody, unless other people know your passwords, they can't go in and shut those things down. And they can contact companies and say to Twitter, so and so is dead, can you take their Twitter account off? But you've got to fill in about 15,000 forms and wait 12 years for them to get back to you an answer. So it's an incredibly laborious process, and you have to prove that that person is dead. And then you get arguments about who has the right, which surviving relative has the right to say, I want this account shut down, particularly if some other relative says, no, I want it kept open. No, I don't want my child's blog page shut down. I want it to be there forever and ever and ever. And some other relative says, like you were saying, it's over, it's done, close it down, and move on. So it's not just where you leave your money and who gets the china, who gets the collection of books or whatever. It's now what happens, who inherits your social media presence, and what do they do with it? Do they just say, oh, well, they're dead, let's delete everything? Or do they keep it like a shrine that they can keep going back and reading whatever it was that you put on your social media platforms, and listen to the music you uploaded, or read the blog posts you put up there, or whatever? What do they do in terms of relationship to the virtual life of somebody who no longer is around? And so some solicitors are, when people are going to write their wills, encouraging their clientele to include a clause about what happens with their social media presence. It's like an envelope saying, these are all my passwords, please go in and do something, shut them down, or whatever it is that that person wants done. So now you have to think about, what do I want to happen to all of my rubbish online when I'm not around anymore?
I didn't realise that. I don't know whether anybody else did.
It opens up a whole new weird world of because half the planet, well, over half the planet is online.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of presence.
But the family can just close it down, can't they?
Eventually. But it takes a lot of doing.
It's a real hassle, isn't it? Because we're faced with privacy issues, and some of the families are really, like I know Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix's family is very private about what they let out and license out, and you're not allowed to. Some people set up official accounts pretending to be. Have you seen the one on Facebook? This is a ridiculous one. Daily updates on Michael Jackson's health. And every day he posts since he's died, he's dead, and that's it. It's really weird. Well, it's a bot that just says he's dead every single day, and people will comment on saying that he gets better tomorrow. It's like, oh, come on, like, yeah, it's a tricky one to get them shut down. Facebook aren't very cooperative with that.
They're even more awkward than the banks when you're trying to.
Yeah.
Or electric companies if you need to get them to transfer the account to some still living relative. But that's, you could argue that is a form of mourning if you choose to preserve someone's websites and what have you after their death. That becomes a way of remembering, like keeping their photographs on the wall or whatever. It's a form of mourning. Possibly not one that they themselves would approve of. They might be sitting there thinking, I wish you'd, in the afterlife, thinking, I wish you'd get rid of all that, but especially if they've said anything that maybe with the passage of time doesn't bear scrutiny, expressed opinions that suddenly become very unpopular, something like that. I know that's not at all readable, that's very tiny print, but the photograph at the top is, or possibly more to the point, was the tombstone that Achille sat on. You might just about be able to see his face in the image right at the top there. So in the couple of weeks after his death, his family put a very, very fancy, must have been very, very expensive, tombstone for him in the local cemetery, with 3 panels, all engraved, some of it was engraved with his quotes and all sorts of things. When the scandal broke and hit the newspapers about his decades worth of molesting children and all the other horrific things that he did, the family took the decision to remove the headstones before anyone turned up with a sledgehammer to smash them to pieces, which is probably what would have happened if they'd left them there. Somebody would have vandalized them quite quickly. So he went from being Mr. Charity Man to be praised up in the newspapers of all the millions he raised for Stoke Mandeville Hospital, this, that, and he did, to very rapidly being an absolute monster that no one would admit to liking when they discovered he was actually a paedophile and all of the other things that he was engaged in doing that had been kept secret all of those years. So this notion of grievability, that some people even want, can you grieve the death of someone? And this applies as much to his family as it would do to people who watch Jimmy Savile's Jim will Fix It TV program and Top of the Pops appearances and all the rest of it. People might have liked him as a celebrity before they knew what he was getting up to. They might have quite liked him and liked his TV shows and all the rest of it. But suddenly he's dead and it all comes out. He then becomes, because of the nature of what he did when he was alive, he becomes ungrievable. Because he's gone beyond the veil. And that's an interesting one, particularly if it's a relative. I mean, it's one thing if it's a celebrity, because there's a big gap between you and them. But if it's an actual relative that's died, a brother, a sister, an aunt, an uncle, or whatever, and then it is discovered that they've done dreadful things, your initial shock, your initial grief at the death of someone who might not have done anything to you personally, so you might quite like them, but they've done maybe horrific things to other people. It then opens up this interesting can of worms about grief, and this is Butler's point, that whilst you might grieve in private and be very sad at the loss of that relative, you know if you were to express that sorrow in public, other people would react very badly and say, why are you getting upset about a dead paedophile or a dead whatever that person happened to be? Why do you care that they're dead? Does it almost imply, if you're upset about the death of a known paedophile, it can be sort of taken, well, are you one too? Sort of, there is an implication there that grief implies sympathy for someone's behaviour. And not just paedophilia, the death of someone, a war criminal, a Nazi war criminal, for example. All of those Nazi war criminals that, whether they died of old age or were executed or whatever, they all had families, they had presumably friends, people who presumably liked them, who might well feel grief in private now that Uncle Hans has died, even if Uncle Hans had murdered 4 million people in the course of his career. You certainly couldn't go and publicly mourn the death of Uncle Hans because everyone would start assuming you must be a Nazi as well and be sympathetic to all the horrific things he did when he was working in Dachau or wherever it was he worked. It then sort of, you get this two-tier approach that what you feel quietly at home cannot be articulated in public. because that person has put themselves beyond the point of acceptability.
So if you have this two levels of grieving at the same time, so does Butler talk about inner conflict? Because you have to, somehow within yourself agree how this works, and I don't think you can fully control that. And the second thing is, I think it's quite constraining. You don't have really freedom because you have to be controlling how you express that grief and where you are, on which level.
Absolutely.
Public or private.
Constantly monitoring yourself.
Yeah.
Which does get particularly blurred with things like social media, because people treat it as private. I'm just writing a message to my friends, but they forget there's probably thousands of people who can read that as well. So it's actually private and public. And so it's not just I'll only say this behind closed doors at home. It's also thinking wherever if you wanted to express grief, you'd have to be very controlled and self-controlled about where and in front of whom you were expressing sorrow.
So it really reduces your freedom.
Yeah. And you would have to become emotionally quite bottled up. And that Butler makes the point that you might just choose to stay silent in public, just not say anything when anyone mentions the issue. Or you might feel obliged to go along with the public view. So if everyone else is saying, what a dreadful old monster, good riddance, even though privately you might have had a very different experience of that person, when you're in public, you might feel obliged to say good riddance to the old monster as well, because that's what everybody else is saying. And that sort of human sheep instinct to follow the herd, to not stand out, to repeat what other people are saying, whether or not you privately feel it, you could then be upset at home and contemptuous of the person in public. Which is a bit of an odd kind of
that's what I was thinking, because I know if somebody that I loved and honoured and admired, when he died, if I found out that he was a murderer but anyway, I wouldn't be able to think the same about him.
No.
I'd see him in that light,
yes.
Because that had been proved, and the previous sort of feelings I had were just sort of based on a few kind acts he did.
Yes, even the most dreadful person must have days when they're quite nice.
Yeah.
Even
if it's their own benefit. Yes.
Yeah. And that does create a real sort of a split.
Yes, it
within
does.
in terms of how you present someone.
Yeah, the closer that person is to you, the more you feel split.
So that's the other photo, the one at the bottom. That's not for a celebrity. The place those people are gathered in is a pauper's grave, where generations worth of very, very poor children had been buried without any headstone, just chucked in a pit, basically, with dozens and dozens of other bodies. Those people, I don't think any of them are actually related to the children that are buried there, but they live in the area and they'd found out about the issue of the area, and they'd been so shocked at the way these kids had been just dumped in a ditch that they clubbed together and built the headstone to mark the spot where all of those bodies are buried. So people who were never publicly grieved in their own lifetime, they were just dirt poor people, they were dead, and no one could give a damn, chuck them in the pit.
But the family could, couldn't they?
Well, the family presumably stood around the pit and felt upset that there was no kind of outward provision.
Yeah.
So that's almost like the dead opposite of the ungrieved suddenly becoming worth grieving for and worth having a headstone for, which is in itself. And once you're dead, you're dead. Whatever your religious beliefs, you're not likely to be aware of what's happening with your body, whether it's buried, cremated, what it is. So that the headstone is not for the direct benefit of the dead, because would they even know it's there? Even if you believe in an afterlife, are they going to be that fussed about whether there's a headstone or not? So the expression of worth, well, in a way, there's a sort of a social guilt about the bad treatment of other people by other people, not they weren't involved in.
No.
ill-treated, but they're kind of shocked by the treatment that they've had. And wanting to, this is, I don't have any, well, I couldn't find any photos connected to the issues with the Magdalen laundries in Ireland, where a number of convents ran homes, for lack of a better word, for unwed mothers, going back a few decades now, where the girls would go along, they'd have their children, and the children would be adopted out, most of them, because obviously Ireland at that time, going back to the 50s, 60s, etc., not an area where you could get away with being an unwed mother. So if the father wasn't willing to marry them, they were farmed off to the laundries because they had to work to earn their keep, and work very, very, very hard. But the conditions were very brutal, and they're now discovering now that most of these convents have been closed down, and that builders are turning up to convert the property into houses or whatever. They're digging up the land, and in so many of these places, they're finding very, very large numbers of children buried, without any record, without any headstone, just chucked in a pit. The implication is that possibly a lot of them died under rather dubious circumstances, or treatment, starvation, violence, and that the nuns just effectively hid the bodies, rather than, had they died of more legitimate means, illness or something, there would have been a more formal process of treating the dead. But there are now a lot of people, some of them very elderly women, who were once in those Magdalen houses. Some of them are relatives, some of them are relatives, some of them just live in the area, have no immediate direct connection to the children or the young women in those places, but are just appalled by what they're hearing, and clubbing together to provide some kind of headstone, a kind of a collective headstone, even though most of these cases they're anonymous bodies with no names, so you can't put a name on the headstone. It's just child after child after child coming out of the ground. But there is now a move in many parts of the world to value people who never were valued at the time they died. At least not in the public sense. Valued by the mothers, I'm sure, but not community valued, not community grieved. So the process of placing the headstone, you could say, is a form of public grief. Here is a place where either there is a body under here, or at least bodies nearby, in the case of this. And even if we don't know who half of them are, we want to make a statement that those lives were worth something. Not at the time they died, probably not very much at the time they were alive, but they are worth something. So it becomes an alternate, rather than repressing grief for some dreadful, dodgy celebrity. This is the opposite. It is introducing grief to people who were the recipients of very wicked grief.
Every life is done.
Yes.
My mother was, I was born in 44, and that was towards the end of the war. And my mother was single, and the partner was in the war, and they couldn't trace each other afterwards. So eventually she married a man that turned out to be a nightmare to her. But would she have suffered a lot more prejudice?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I wasn't
Depends on
sure
the
how they felt at that time with the war, because there must have been a lot of
yes, there were.
occasions like that.
There was also a lot of hostility, especially if it was an American GI. The notion of
All right, so my mother may have married this man who turned out to be a nightmare, just because
respect,
yes, okay,
financial
Oh,
stability.
right. I often wondered that, but I mean, you don't realise at the beginning quite how it's going to turn out. I know that, and I was sort of basing it on that, but it's probably a bit of the other as well. Yeah.
Wanting that kind of social worth,
Yes,
status,
that's
of being
right,
seen
yes.
as respectable as husband.
Yes.
And that kind of does go with what Butler was saying, that some people, whether because choices or accidents of circumstance or whatever, some lives are deemed to be worth less and less and less, because
Yeah.
you've not done what's expected of you, you've
Yeah.
not done the respectable thing, and therefore your value drops. And should you die at a point when your value is at a low end,
That's how you remember it. Yes,
rather than the good things you've done,
yes, yeah. Oh, no.
which is a bit bleak.
Well, life.
Absolutely. There may be things going on at the moment that in another 50 years' time or 100 years' time
Yes.
will
Yeah.
be seen the same way.
Mm.
Because it's quite easy for us to start talking about things that happened 60, 70, 80 years ago in Ireland or wherever as history. That was then. That was, people didn't know any better. So there's going to be people saying we don't know any better at some point because of stuff we're doing now, but will look pretty damn shabby for future generations when they look back on some of
Because we all tend to follow our basic needs, don't we?
Yes, very much.
Yes.
So, group stuff. So that's a little bit. I must admit, Judith Butler is not. Well, she's American. She's probably never even heard of Jimmy. So she wasn't particularly thinking about him, but just him as an example of one of the types of people that doesn't get grief. So this is a quote from one of the slightly less convoluted quotes, which is saying something because she does have a very odd use of grammar and sentence structure. It's very all-over place. That we might prefer to adopt a humanist framework, she's a humanist, and assert that everyone, regardless of race, religion, or origin, has a life that is grievable, which is pretty much what he says. All life is worth something. And then to militate for an acceptance of that basic equality. Militate because it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to get society on the whole to accept it. You can say all life is worth something, and lots of people nod and say, well, yes, it is. But they don't do a damn thing about it to put that motion into practice. And so what she's saying is that you've got to move beyond just saying that everyone is worth something, to insisting that social systems treat everyone as worth something, because frequently they don't. And she is, like a lot of sociologists, she is quite keen on bringing about change, rather than just writing books that describe the way the world is. She wants to make improvements. I suspect not everyone would agree that some of the things she wants to change would be improvements. Some of her ideas are quite controversial, but this is part of her push to try and get people all over the planet to reassess whose life they regard as important and whose life they regard as unimportant and not worth shedding tears over, not worth making an effort over. One of the issues she touches on a little bit, I'm trying to gloss over this because we could end up going right down a rabbit hole and spending hours on this alone. But one of the factors she touches on is that it's not always obvious what even constitutes a life in the first place in order to then warn it. One of the big issues is, especially for Catholics, but also for quite a few other people and other religions, is the unborn. At what point does a fetus become a person? And even to say it's a fetus kind of makes it sound like less of a human being. It's not a person, it's this blob, we call that blob a fetus, not a person. So, and obviously it will affect many, many women and many men as well who've lost a child, particularly an unborn child. At what point, to a large extent, that's a very personal choice of the individual as to how they emotionally react to the death of a child that's only been there a month or 2 months or 3 months or 4 months or however long it's been there for. Do they want a funeral? Do they want some kind of ritual? Do they just want it sort of treated almost like medical waste in a sense and just taken away, or do they want to have some kind of interment or cremation, whatever would be appropriate? Is that for any child, even one that's only been in existence a very, very short period of time? Or does it become more of a necessity the closer that child is to 9 months? And the more developed, the more looking like a human being that child becomes, and moves from something minuscule to something that looks an awful lot more like a baby. Certainly, most people, the more human, closer to 9 months it is, the more shocking, the more upsetting, the more there is a need for funeral and ritual and public grief and taking time off work and getting upset and crying and being supported by friends and family. But equally, at the other end, there's a lot of people who would struggle to understand if that miscarriage happens very, very early on, let's say after a couple of weeks or a couple of months, who would not react in the same way as if it happened at 6 months. Because they would not necessarily, in their mind at least, regard the 2-month-old fetus as a person in the same way that they might regard a 6-month-old fetus, baby, as a person. So quite when does it become a person? Stop being it, become a person. There's no answer to that one.
No, there isn't. I had 2 miscarriages both at 11 weeks consecutively. I think it's that unknowing and agree in that, in how and why, because there's no answers at that time. But yeah, I've had family and friends that have had miscarriages later on, and they've been able to have an answer to why. So I think it's more of the not knowing that stimulates the grief.
Yeah.
In a sense, if you know what I mean. I think that unknowing is more detrimental to the person's ability to get over it than having a definition or an answer to why.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely.
That's my personal opinion. I don't know, but
Context us.
yeah.
Absolutely. So there's that kind of end of the age range. At what point is that unborn child a child, a person, who deserves the same funerals and rituals and so forth, and of course not just the child, but the mother, the father, the family, in terms of needing emotional support and so forth. When is it of the same level that you would expect if a born child were to die in infancy? You would naturally have a funeral. But does the same guideline apply to the unborn? At the other end of the age scale, a lot of people who have a relative with Alzheimer's or dementia of some type often feel that the mind, the person they knew, can cease to exist quite a long period of time before the body ceases. So the mind goes, and then years later the body goes. So when the body goes, for some people, they've almost already done the grieving because they've been weeping for the loss of their mother, father, grandmother, whoever it is.
In the end, it's such a relief when it comes to it. They seem it's conflicting because they see the process and then there's no interaction anymore. They just see a body. There's just nothing. I've seen it with several family members, and in the end, it's a relief for them and for the family. One, the family don't want to see them like that, and a relief that they're at peace as such. So yeah.
Because they see this person they knew.
Yes.
That wasn't there any longer, but the body was still there.
Yeah.
And then finally it goes.
Yeah. But you're just basically going with them, aren't you? Mm.
It's certainly that real sense, because almost you're mourning someone unofficially.
Yeah.
Years, maybe months before their body actually does.
Yeah.
But when you're mourning the loss of the person, the personality, the mind, whatever you call it, there's no funeral, there's no ceremony, there's no particular support or network. You can't go to your boss and say, can I have a few days off because I'm horrified at my father, my mother's mind has gone. They're still alive, because the boss's question is, well, are they dead or not?
Yeah.
Well, no.
Not physically, no.
Not physically, exactly. And that then becomes a sort of an uncertainty as to what it is. And now you could argue that almost at any age, because obviously there are brain injuries and all sorts of things that can happen at any age that might rob a person of their state of mind. And then they're a body, but the personality is just not there anymore. So regardless of whether it's very elderly or somebody at a much younger age that's had a disease or an accident or whatever, when we grieve death, is it per se the death of the body we're grieving, or is it the loss of the person, the mind, the personality, the individual, which isn't wholly one and the same thing as the body going? Clearly, when the body goes, yes, but that person can actually depart before their body departs. And what we're grieving is really maybe the person, more so than the body as such. But the body's going to be part of it. So
Because the body can't go before the person, the mind goes.
Yes.
It can happen the other way around. Yeah.
That's a difficult challenge to so she did. Typical sociologist, she asks questions, she doesn't give answers. She just goes hanging for people to make their own decisions.
Apply psychologist.
It's a point to consider. This sort of idea of the lack of grievability and the factors involved has very, very recently, actually people writing about this in essays, come to the fore during the whole COVID crisis, with various groups of people, the very elderly and younger people with pronounced learning disabilities and things like that in care homes, who contracted COVID and often been sent home from the hospital to go back to where it was they lived, with the do not resuscitate notice and their babies and their not because they've asked for it, because often they were in a situation to ask for it in the first place. But the doctors, possibly influenced by the budget holders at the hospitals, who have got a real eye to the financial cost of care and which life is worth spending £1,000 or £10,000 or whatever much it might be, and which lives are not deemed to be worth spending that amount of money on. And this is really where Achille Mbembe kind of puts these arguments that frequently to keep somebody alive does cost money. Medicines, care, doctors, nurses, care workers, all the rest of it. It's got to be paid for. And there isn't always enough money to go around. Or at least if there is money, it's not made available, it's been spent on other things. There are individuals having to decide, budget holders, we can afford to keep you and you alive, but we can't afford to keep you and you alive. And so they're having to decide whose life is worth the money. And that's a bit of a grim thought to think that all of us have a price tag. That somebody somewhere is going to be thinking, is he worth 50 quid? And sometimes the answer to that question will be no. We'll look at, as we go along, some of the factors that both Judith, Butler and Achille Mbembe are arguing shape the decisions about whose life is worth £1,000 or £10,000 or £12, or however much somebody is willing or not willing to spend on it. But it has made it very clear the whole COVID crisis that some people's lives are not valued by the system. Valued by their relatives, certainly, but not valued by the care home systems, by the hospital systems, ultimately, of course, by government who are making the decisions about financing. That some lives are just not deemed worth the money. And it's not that they're going around putting pillows on people's faces and trying to suffocate them. They're just saying, well, if they're going to die, then don't spend the money to keep them alive. And that's something that Mbembe is quite conscious of, but it's not necessarily governments deliberately killing people, shooting them. It's governments just saying, you're not worth the money. And leaving someone to die.
But some people would also make that decision because they felt they didn't want anyone to suffer.
Oh, potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Relatives saying that it's too much.
Yeah, you could keep them alive, but we don't want them to suffer like that. Yeah.
Again, it's a different kettle of fish when it's the family deciding rather than some faceless institution deciding. We're just going to leave you in the corner and see what happens.
Isn't it kind of an extension of the Malthus principle
Yes.
of population control? So it's not
Yes.
necessarily like they've started a war in order to cull the population. It's more of a
Seizing the advantage.
yeah, the advantage. You know, there's it's a plague. It's often disease or natural famine or natural disaster, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's sort of well, we can't really afford to do it because they've had to make a decision. Whether the one I usually see referred to as the Bengal famine, where it was the choice of feed the Indian people or divert food back to the British Isles, which are being starved out. So it's sort of and it's usually that's where the ration part comes into it, because you've got obviously there's parts of particularly an empire where it's like you're one nation except in a time of crisis where funds are withdrawn, and that's what the Scottish are making at the moment as well, aren't they? The Scottish and the Northern parts, because he wants to level up life expectancy. He wants to cut life expectancy. He wants to narrow the gap. So the Northerners have, it sounds about the Northerners have a better chance of actually living longer on the same par as people from the South.
You might need to get rid of all those deep fried Mars bars and drugs. There's a reason some people don't.
Yeah.
It's certainly great, but that word precarity, Butler does like awkward words, it has to be said. She uses it to make the argument that all human life is precarious. Any one of us could be run over by a bus on the way home today. It could happen. You'd never know. When you say goodbye to somebody and they go home, you've got no guarantee you'll definitely see them tomorrow, or that they will see you tomorrow, of course, because human life can end very suddenly. Accidents happen, diseases happen, all sorts of things can happen. So anyone is in a precarious state. And as far as Butler is concerned, most of us don't want to think about that because it's depressing. Most of us, when we say goodbye to somebody, fully expect to see them again. We don't like thinking that might be the very last time we ever said goodbye to that relative, that friend, that whoever they are. But of course, one day it will be. In any relationship, one day you'll say goodbye to somebody and you won't see them again. Or maybe they won't see you again, as the case may be. So that will happen again and again and again, but we don't like thinking about it. And she does make the extension that because we don't like thinking about it, we get upset when we see other people whose lives are very, very, very obviously precarious. So she gives examples of the homeless, the people who are so close to the edge of death. They're half-starved, disease-riddled, living in conditions of hypothermia in a cardboard box or whatever. Why do we often look the other way? She says it's because it's too close a reminder of our own mortality and our own vulnerability. And most of us are so ill at ease with the prospect of our own deaths that we don't like to see anything that reminds us that there, but for the grace of God, go I, that could be me, I could be homeless, I could be in a war, I could be raddled with the disease, I could be this, that, and the other. We don't like to think about that. And so it's very painful to see people who you can't pretend are anything other than precarious. I can pretend I'm okay. Now, I'm not expecting to be run over by us. I'm not expecting to get some horrific disease, but I could. And if I'm sensible, obviously, I have as much chance as anyone of suffering some sudden unfortunate fate, but I don't want to think about it. Well, she says it would be better if we did, if we learned to come to terms with that and started living our lives accordingly. So in other words, why put off to tomorrow What you have no guarantee of having a tomorrow before. So hopefully in a nice sense, not as in go and punch that person you really want to. But enjoy your life now, because there might not be a tomorrow to enjoy it. It is essentially what she's putting forward as a message. But we spend too much time saying to ourselves, oh well, tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. And one day there isn't a tomorrow. And then it's too late to do anything about it. So we could take our precarity and use it to live much more exciting lives by saying, I'll get on with my life, I'll do all the fun things I want to do, and I'll do it now. I won't wait for this imaginary tomorrow, because it might not be there. But that's not an easy thing to do, and we don't really live in a society that's designed for us to do that. We live in a society that wants us to keep turning up at work, keep filling in the paperwork, keep paying the taxes, keep saving up for tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. It doesn't want us to live like dogs in the moment and live as if the only moment is now. Society wouldn't operate for very long if we all did that. It would start to fall apart very, very quickly. But that's what she feels we kind of ought to be moving towards, but in practice we don't. And so we get nervous around the severely disabled, the very, very ill, the homeless, anybody else who is very obviously close to death. And we don't like to see that, because not only is it often people don't know what to say, they feel so awkward, they don't quite know how to handle it, but it's too much of a reminder of our own vulnerability. And that, she feels, is the real problem. The reminder of our vulnerability is more of an issue than feeling a bit awkward and not knowing quite what to say to somebody. So that's a bit of a bleak view. Patterson builds on ideas that have been knocking around for multi-thousand years, but uses the phrase social death to suggest that society often treats some people as if they were dead already, when they're not. And so you can suffer a social death of exclusion, or being treated like someone who isn't really there, that you don't matter, you don't count. I suppose a fairly obvious example is that habit that sometimes you can see of saying, does he take sugar? When there's somebody who's maybe disabled or whatever. Instead of asking that person, do you take sugar in your tea? The person talks to the carer. So does he take sugar? As if he's not really there and not able to answer the question for himself. So that kind of treating people as if you're not really a proper person. So we're often with disabilities, with illnesses, with learning disabilities, and a variety of other issues, where there's a tendency to treat some people as if, you can see it with homeless people sometimes, that they get literally stepped over, as if they're just a bit of rubbish on the street, and somebody will step over them to continue on their journey. Not even say, excuse me, or whatever, just, a bit of rubbish in the doorway to be moved around, rather than an actual human being, an actual person. And of course, when it comes to some of these things like disabilities and illnesses and being homeless, any one of us could end up in that state. These things could happen to anybody. And one day you're a person, the next day you get ill, or you lose your home, or whatever, and you're treated as if you're not really there at all. That you're not capable of thinking, you're not capable of making decisions, you're not even worth saying excuse me to, when somebody just steps over you as you're lying in a shop doorway. And it's a bit grim. This isn't a cheery one. I'm trying to put on a saying it's a bit more upbeat than this. Getting a bit bleak. So examples of people who get treated as worth less than other people. The unborn, we've already talked about that. Lots of people are unsure, is that unborn child a person yet, or do we have to wait to a certain period of time when the fetus has developed a brain, or developed this or developed that, and then we're treated as a person. So there's all that kind of discussion as to whether some people are people. It's usually the more severely disabled rather than people with more mild disabilities that are often treated as if their life is worth significantly less than other people's lives are. As with the COVID situation, people approaching their later years, particularly if it's things like hospital bed issues, and I had a talk a few years ago by someone who was on the ethics board of a hospital committee. He was explaining how they have to make decisions where if the funding doesn't allow every patient to be treated, they have to get together and say, well, this patient costs this much to treat their issues, and that patient costs that much to treat their issues. So we could afford to treat him, or we could afford to treat that, but we can't afford to treat both. And then we have to weigh up the two lives and effectively decide which life is worth spending money on, and which life has to wait till next budget rolls around, if they're even still alive by the time the next budget rolls around. And some of the factors they look at are expected lifespan. Is this person likely to live another 5 years, another 25 years, another 55 years? The longer that person is likely to live if they're treated, the more value their life has to spend money with medical treatment. And conversely, if someone they say to themselves, well, they'll probably be dead in a year anyway, even with the treatment, they're much less likely to provide it, because the argument is you don't have as many years left as somebody half the age or a quarter of the age. So that kind of, which is pretty much what we're seeing going on in COVID.
Is that decision taken very often, do you think?
Yes.
It is?
More often than most of us want to think about.
Yeah, okay.
And not always life or death situations, sometimes it's
Yes.
who gets it,
others.
who doesn't get it.
Yes, yeah.
Who gets left in pain and who hopefully is taken out of pain. But the
And is that because of lack of resources? Right.
resources for the, there are, I'm sure we could have, if we wheeled a politician into the room, I'm sure we could have discussions about
Resources.
how the resources are allocated and whether hospitals maybe, if they didn't spend money on, there was a report recently in one of the newspapers about a hospital being billed 300 quid for someone to come in and change a light bulb because they had a contract with an independent maintenance company. And they were clearly being ripped off, but they were tied into this contract. So it may be if the money wasn't spent on one thing, it would be spent on medications instead of being spent on changing light bulbs or whatever. So there are budgetary arguments that can be had, but even there, you still ultimately say that there is not a bottomless pit of money. At some point, the money will run out, and then decisions have to be made. Can we afford this medication or that medication, this surgery or that surgery? And that's when you get into these kind of quite.
I knew that happened, but I didn't realise how much it happened.
Frequent.
Right. Okay.
So big grim. Yeah, the prisoner issue. I was initially thinking when I put prisoners there that some crimes put people, having mentioned Jimmy Savile earlier, there are some crimes that would put people really beyond the point of acceptability, where a lot of individuals would say, why are they getting special treatment? Why are they being fed and watered? And so on. But often, even if they're in for a fairly minor crime, if there's a newspaper headline of X amount of money spent on prisoners, frequently the reaction is, why do they deserve money to be spent on them? Even if they're in for something quite minor, rather than for something horrific. So it's not always necessarily just that they are serial killers and cannibals and child molesters. Sometimes they're shoplifters who are being moaned about as why do they deserve to be treated in a certain way. So we're not mad keen as a society on prisoners being treated well. And if you compare that to, say, Denmark or Norway, Sweden, the Scandinavian countries, some of their prisons look more like Butlers, holiday camps, because they invest a lot of money in what they feel will rehabilitate the prisoner by treating them well. rather than putting them on bread and water in a grotty cell that sits other people. Their argument is that if you treat people really badly in prison, they'll come out angry, frustrated, and they'll lash out and they'll commit more crime. Whereas if you reintegrate them by treating them nicely, they'll become better citizens and not commit more crimes in the future. But that's a very different model. It's one that doesn't go down too well in America or here or various other countries where we tend to favour much tougher treatments in prisons because their lives are not seen to be worth as much. In a similar vein, the people getting up to dodgy criminal activities on the streets, the ones who haven't been caught yet, how often do we perhaps overhear discussions that one drug dealer has stabbed another drug dealer to death, and somebody says, "Oh well, that's one less drug dealer then, isn't it?" Who cares? Good riddance. That life is not worth as much as the life of somebody who doesn't deal in drugs and drink again. Undoubtedly, a lot of gang members do get up to some really horrible things and cause a lot of misery and grief, but there is that sort of automatic assumption that even if they were enjoying the game yesterday, but they haven't done much of anything there, automatically their life goes down a few pegs. And if they die, well, they're not dead. There's not as much value, as much effort put into wanting to keep them alive. And a similar problem with undocumented migrants that you often hear. Now, there was a situation a few years ago where a boat dinghy coming over from France sank. I think almost everyone on it drowned. And then there was one of the news channels had the clip uploaded to their YouTube site. And if you just scrolling through the comments, screen underneath, that was a bit.
They get a bit spicy.
Yeah.
Spicy, especially if it's uploaded by the Daily Mail or Sky News, then you're in for a real. It'd be fair, like you could easily mistake it for a far right message board.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sentiments along the lines of what a pity more of them didn't.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Yes. A bit. There's a grim view of human nature and what we are prepared to allow. Well, I'm not sure we allow people to drown per se, but don't feel much grief or shock or upset if they do drown. So it's.
But is there another way? Is there any other way? I mean, the other way would be to give some money to both good and bad. But
Yeah.
we haven't got, I presume there's not enough money.
Not that we're spending billions on track and trace. Which is a moment, maybe the money is there, but it gets spent on other stuff.
Yes, it may be. I'm just wondering what.
We're back to almost like the hospital situation. Well, would we sooner spend 37 billion on this or on this? And at least politicians tend to prefer that. So
The big irony was the big ironic thing was that they were trying to crack down on illegal boat crossings in the channel, and they went and spent billions on a new yacht. It's like, well, you put the money into the wrong boats there. You missed the point.
Decisions get made, and they're not always very nice decisions. I know that's not very readable, but to give a sort of perspective in other cultures, the chap on the left is an imam. I think he's going by memory, Pakistan, I think it was, but expressing the opinion that apostasy, which is somebody who is born a Muslim and then stops being a Muslim, apostasy is keeping up whatever religion you're born into. So as far as he is concerned, he's not the only voice expressing. So he isn't just some random crazy person. This is quite a widely held point of view in some parts of the world, that anyone who converts away from that religion to a different religion or becomes an atheist or an agnostic or whatever is worthy of death. That act makes them killable, but their life has suddenly lost its value. So it's not only in very extreme cases like Jimmy Savile molesting small children. who are then deemed as worth much less and having terrible awful people, terrible lives. In some parts of the world, you can engage in behaviours that wouldn't garner much shock if they hadn't been bring. If over here somebody says, well, I used to be a Christian, but I'm not. Not many people would say, you deserve to die. But in some parts of the world, they would. Their life would plummet in value. The guy in the right is a politician in Chechnya who a couple of years ago was expressing the viewpoint that if there were any gay people in Chechnya, apparently there aren't, but if there were,
Keep it quiet.
then he's saying that the families would deal with them in a way that would remove the shame from their blood, from their family lineage. And it has been expressed by various Chechen politicians that if some families deal with it by dragging Uncle Bob out to the woods and shooting him in the back of the head, then they will not be charged with murder. Because Uncle Bob's life is no longer worth anything at all. So, yeah.
Did you say that was the current
the
situation in some countries?
Chechnya particularly, they've been quite upfront about it. But other
I imagine they tell that to themselves, but I didn't realise it was sort of in law, by law.
Yes. Well, Chechnya is unusual that they've been so open about it. There are other parts of the world where they're not that open, but no one would make much of an effort to investigate the death of someone who was believed probably to be gay. So again, it's whose life is worth what, basically. And depends where you are in the world and what you do. And some lives are decidedly seen. In that case, he's obviously almost encouraging families to go out and murder off their relatives, which is a much more overt form of necropolitics than just saying leave them to die. This is saying round them up, take them out and shoot them in effect. So sometimes it tips over into quite extreme forms of attitude. That's Achille Mbembe himself. He's heavily influenced by the ideas of Michel Foucault in France, partly because Mbembe is a Cameroonian, and the part of Cameroon he lives in is a French-speaking part of Cameroon. So they're very into French culture and French books and so forth, which is probably why he is keen on Foucault rather than some other sociologists. He took an idea from Foucault of biopolitics. Biopolitics to Foucault is the way in which governments try to manage the lives of their people. So offering child support, the movement in the early part of the 20th century, when the population dropped dramatically in the aftermath of the First World War and again in the Second World War, that they then started to introduce policies where you could get at that point in time quite small amounts of money per child as a grant, as a benefit. It was done to encourage people to have children. People who were worried about me, I can't afford to give him my kid. So the government saying, well, here's a little bit of money to help you put food on the table and clothes on the child's back. Go and have a baby. Replenish the population that has decreased. So that's biopolitics, the use of politics and policy to keep people alive, to keep them healthy, to keep them engaged. Those adverts on the TV of late, the little plasticine figures running about, exercising and going on diets and all the rest of it, for these government schemes to encourage people to be more energetic, eat healthy, all the rest of it. That's biopolitics. Coming up with ways to manage people and what they do with their bodies. Supposedly to make us all happy and healthy, but probably more about trying to reduce the NHS bill by not having too many unhealthy people around. He makes the argument that it's not just the living that are managed. He says death is also managed. And governments come up with policies, and not just governments, all the way down to much smaller organisations, come up with policies around death. At one level, that's quite straightforward things like what to do if an employee dies. Who do you notify? What do you do? Blah, blah, blah. So most companies and employers and what have you will have policies in place of what to do if a member of their staff dies. What's the procedure to be followed? That's necropolitics at a very basic level. But what that doesn't really interest him. He's not bothered about those kinds of policies. What really interests him is the way governments manage death. If you're a government, your citizens are going to die. That's inevitable. What do you do to regulate the speed and process of death? Because you don't want vast numbers of people dying off all at once. You want to try to stagger it. It's very difficult to run a country if half your population dies on Tuesday. You want to kind of spread it out a bit and manage who dies when and how, and keep it to a point manageable. And part of that is health policies and things like that, which help to stagger these issues out a little bit. Housing policies also have a massive impact on lifespan. Benefits policies have a big impact on lifespan. He says you can divide these policies into two main categories, the active and passive. The active is when a government decides to go out of its way to eliminate a group of people. Like rounding up the Jews, rounding up gypsies, rounding up whoever it is that the government hates most this week, take them off to a death camp, get rid of them. That's active necropolitics. We are going to kill as many of this type of person as we possibly can, and this is the means we're going to do it by. We'll do it with poisons or gas or bullets or whatever it is that they're going to do. So they come up with policies and procedures, trains departing from here with X amount of people stuffed in the back of them. All of that is a means of necropolitics, the management of active death. These days, thankfully, that is relatively rare. You don't see too much of that going on. Although the guy from Chechnya in the previous slide, that's necropolitics. That's saying, if you want to kill them off, you kill them off. We won't do anything about it. Off you pop. Go and shoot wherever it is. That's necropolitics.
The camps in China as well.
The weepers.
Yeah, that's quite
horrific.
But they just, again, it's just easy to deny it rather than actually, because they're just jabbing them with needles at this point. One of the detectives said they stuck an arm through a hole, they just jab you with a needle and you don't know what they've jabbed you with. And it's like an active policy.
Yes.
But even if you've got the proof, it's sort of no, it didn't happen. It's not happening, it's not how it's going to work.
They do similar things with the famine bomb in China as well. That's been going on for quite a few years, including allegedly organ harvesting, where they wouldn't
allegedly, yeah,
which wasn't healthy to sell to the unhealthy. Although everybody in the family is like a religious movement and they are vegetarians and live very healthy lives, teetotal, which is a really good reason not to be a teetotal vegetarian, because someone will come after your organs at some point.
I'm a vegetarian. I'm not teetotal.
It's that's apparently why they do it, because they're just so healthy that their organs are worth having. So they sell them on the black market.
I'll offer no chance of that.
Passive necropolitics is allowing people to die by not helping them, not keeping them alive, not providing them with services that are needed to keep them alive. So it's in effect saying, let's not give housing to the homeless. Let's just leave them in the streets. So it's not shooting them, it's just leave them on the streets. What's going to happen? Well, if you're homeless, you are almost inevitably going to die quite a few years younger than you probably would have done had you been living at home, because of hypothermia or disease or drinking meths or doing all of the kind of things that homeless people tend to end up doing. So it's effectively writing that bunch of people off and saying, well, just let them get on with it. If they die, they die. They're not worth the effort, the time, the money that would be needed to provide them with housing and care and support, or night shelters or whatever else would help to keep those people alive. That obviously you do get church groups and things like that doing soup kitchens, but that's not government policy, that's individuals acting off their own back to try to keep people in that situation alive a little bit longer. What they really need to keep them properly alive would be address the housing, address the addictions, address the health problems, and that's not something that a small church group can do. They just don't have the resources. That's something the government does. But for that body of people, it doesn't do it. It just leaves them. Some governments are better than others at trying to help, clearly. So it's not condemning every single government. But his argument is that people just get written off, they get left as irrelevant. And he asks the question, who gets written off? Now, if you are one of these people being written off, the phrase he uses is the living dead. You become the living dead. So you're not dead yet, the clock is ticking. And no one is helping you to stay alive. Not the government, not any of the other institutions that might help you. They've just abandoned you. He particularly uses that phrase in conjunction with war zones. He writes a lot about war zones, Africa, Palestine, various other places, where governments take the policy that those villages along the border where they're all going to get bombed to hell and back, but tough luck. And just write whole swathes of people off to say, well, if they die, they die. What a shame. You know, similar to some of the categories we were mentioning earlier, there's all sorts of people who arguably are written off. Not necessarily because they're dreadful people, they've done anything particularly horrific, they're just written off as not deserving the services that would be needed to sustain their lives for a normal lifestyle, the same kind of lifespan that anybody else might be expected to have. I dare say if we sat here and we had a bit more time than we've got, we could come up with a few other groups that could be put on that list. In Britain or in other parts of the world where other groups might come on that list of people that get written off and left. But potentially these groups are groups that any of us could end up in if we're not lucky, which is a bleak prospect. Why they get put in those groups, he offers various arguments. He's a bit like Foucault himself. There is a kind of an underpinning of Marxist ideas, although he's not a full-on red flag waving Marxist. He's got a few ideas from that end of the market. So he makes the argument that a lot of this boils down to money and resources. Who is deemed a good source of revenue? Who is not? So people that are money generators are likely to be kept alive. People who are not generating much money at all are likely to be written off and left to die. So it's not like I said on the previous slide, one of the groups was the elderly. That needs to be qualified. If we're talking about Rupert Murdoch or Lord Rothschild, then the amount of money that would go into keeping them alive is still whatever illnesses, diseases, infirmities of old age they have, they will get every resource they could possibly need and then some to keep them alive because they're phenomenally rich and they produce more wealth as they go. None of them have retired, they're still churning out money, they're still in business. Therefore, when we say the elderly get written off, we mean the poor elderly, not the super duper rich elderly. If you're rich, you will be in the high attention category of society bending over backwards, forwards and sideways to keep it going, or at least this is Mbembe's point of view. If on the other hand, you've retired, you're not paying tons in taxation, you're living a modest life on a small income, you're likely to be seen as not much of a prospect in terms of raking in money for society. So your life will suddenly shift down the scale of worth. If you then have certain factors like illnesses, disabilities, things like that, which might require a lot of money to be spent on you, medication, wheelchairs, this, that, and the other, that you might need. So rather than earning money, you're consuming resources that have to be given to you. You will move even more rapidly down that list of worth because you've gone from, at some point in your life, perhaps earning money, paying lots of taxes, to suddenly not earning money, not paying much tax, and needing stuff to be spent on you to help with your various needs. The more you consume, the less you generate, the more towards the getting written off end of the scale will be pushed. Because that's his argument is what makes life valuable in a capitalist system. I'm not sure personally it would be any different in a communist or a socialist system. What makes lives valuable? Money. Basically, is what it boils down to. If you've got a lot of it, your life is important. If you don't have much of it, your life is much less important. And the social systems will not be geared to support you. It's a bit of a grim read, but might be true. The hostilities issue in periods of war, sometimes other factors aside from war come into play, and a group of people are likely to be perceived as a threat. We've got to be careful of them because they might do X, Y, Z to us. All of the Second World War propaganda coming out of Germany was this group, that group, some of them are a threat to us, and we have to do something about them. Which once again is necropolitics. So whether that group of people actually are a threat is almost besides the point. As long as somebody thinks they're a threat, that will get them treated in a far more shoddy fashion and push them either into being actively exterminated or at least being written off as not worth the effort of keeping alive, because they're a problem, they're a risk, they're a danger in some capacity. And I do wonder if some of the, going back to the dodgy website, Daily Mail postings about seeking migrant ideas, perhaps a lot of that is the assumption that they would, if they got over here, they would be a threat, they'd be doing X, Y, Z. Therefore, if they drown before they arrive, in some people's minds, the threat is neutralized. Because they have been convinced, whether it's by newspaper headlines or whatever, they've been convinced that that group of people are a threat. Take away jobs, take away housing, plant bombs, do this, do that, that they're possibly some of them might do, but it's most likely a very exaggerated threat as to what actual risk are most of those people, probably not much of it in most cases. One or two might have major problems that need addressing. You know, there have been attacks and murders and things committed by people. So some people, yes, are a threat, but the majority are probably not. But if the perception is that they're a threat, they're much more likely to be unmoored if they do drown at sea. Because people are thinking, well, I'm not going to value and grieve over the life of someone who's a danger to me. It's an understandable human reaction, even if it's usually the simple one. The other factor that gets talked about is morality, which kind of goes, I suppose, back to that Chechen post, that if a group of people are perceived as immoral, wicked, terrible, dreadful people, not a threat necessarily, but just immoral, they get up to disgusting things that we don't want to think about, then they are, again, unlikely to be written off. Certainly, Butler talks extensively in several of her publications about the 1980s AIDS crisis and the whole perception that AIDS, HIV was caused by gay people, caused by drug users, they're dirty people, they get up to disgusting things. Do they deserve all this money spent on them? Why don't we just put them on a line and let them done? Which was an argument being made by quite a lot of people back in the 80s. You know, they're a perceived threat because you might catch something off them, and they're also immoral. And so possibly there wouldn't have been too many people saying shoot them, but there were quite a few people saying put them on an island somewhere, just kind of leave them on an island and let them die. So effectively, necropolitics write them off. They're a non-group of people. They're not worth keeping alive.
What did you say happened in the 80s? In regards to that?
Well, it was popularly argued. Nobody did it. Nobody actually put HIV patients on islands.
You just mentioned an example, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah. What was that example? Sorry, I missed it.
Just about put exiled people to an island.
Oh, I see.
So they
Okay,
could infect
right,
anyone else and just
yes,
dump them somewhere,
yeah, don't know, yeah.
leave them to die, basically.
Yes.
Is what it boiled down to. Which is not nice. But then that's the point that Mbembe and Butler are making. This doesn't tend to lead people to behave in a nice way. It tends to lead people to behave in a very brutal way, a very callous, uncaring way. What can be done about it? Well, get the impression that Mbembe has probably pulled most of his hair out, trying to come up with solutions to this one and run out of them. He sees it more as an issue of global politics that needs addressing, whereas Butler sees it more as something that we as individuals can start to address in their own lives by not walking over the homeless person in the street, that sort of thing, by trying to value the lives of the people around us, not writing people off, not trying to treat them as irrelevant, trying to see all life as having worth. So it's, for her, it starts at a small level, but it's something that she does feel institutions can address more by treating all life as well. Quite how that would happen in reality, I'm not wholly clear on. But she has perhaps a bit more of an optimistic outlook that things can change. Whereas Mbembe, in looking at these big global pictures and war-torn countries and so forth, tends to come away with a very bleak view of where all of this is going. Cheer to be done. Which does bring us to the end. On a bit of a bomb note on. Anyone have any thoughts? Is it as bleak as I've made it sound, or is there more hope?
That was very good, thank you.
Do anyone disagree with Butler? Are we nicer than Butler thinks we are? Or are we genuinely inclined to be callous?
No, I think you get occasionally, but generally, I don't think so. Because people will always, I presume anyway, that people will always go back to their basics, basic needs, basic, yes.
Sort of
Basic thoughts, yes.
Robin.
Yes.
Oh, gosh, that was very clear and slightly echoey. Can I just make an observation?
Yes.
I was thinking about the Judith Butler quote of grief performed.
Yes.
And thinking about arguably society has been sterilising death and detaching death from grief. And we're hearing of people who are having now quick, no fuss funerals.
Oh, yes.
And there seems to be a trend of detaching and making it, you know, you don't have to suffer, you don't have to grieve, because we'll just make everything nice. And I was just wondering how we will rewrite grief, how we will restructure it in terms of how we understand it through society, and will we ultimately suffer through not being able to grieve?
Undoubtedly. Certainly Freud and just about every other psychologist going would say definitely if we don't process grief, it doesn't go away, it just represses. Anything that's repressed comes out eventually in worse and worse fashion, so that would become problematic. But so then those depressing adverts for companies where they whisk your dead relative away and a fortnight later you get a box of ashes in the post.
But do you think that's due to costs of funerals?
I suspect because some of them are extortionately expensive. But it's when my last dog died, we did send him off to be cremated and got the box of ashes back well, someone's ashes, didn't it? Back a fortnight later. And I do regret that. He was quite a good dog to put in the garden, but I regret not having that immediate involvement with just burying him. rather than kind of it all being done by strangers. And
Yeah.
in my mind, it's just some bored-looking bloke lopping a body onto a trolley and press a button and no one cares. It's just meat.
Yeah.
It's not a living, well, not living. It's not someone who was loved. It's just a lump of meat to be
You'd had your previous dogs
buried. Yes.
buried, yes. What made you change your mind about that's a
certain person, let's put it like that.
Oh, right, okay.
Had it just been me, it would have got him gone.
Yeah.
But,
Does Butler put ritual with performance together?
yes. Even though she's a humanist, and obviously perhaps her idea of ritual is a bit different from plenty of other people's ideas of ritual, but she does see that there is the need to ritualize, and that the whole ritual of death, where there still isn't the ritual of death, is therapeutic. It's a way of helping people come to terms with the fact that so and so is not here anymore, and what they're going to do next, and kind of
Process of saying goodbye.
Yes, absolutely. And that if you don't have that, or some people are excluded, quite common for a lot of funerals to not include children. It's just the adults in the family, not the children in the family, so they don't get to say goodbye to granny or granddad or wherever it is. They don't get included at the funeral. And there is therefore that concern: do they even really understand or get the proper chance to grieve and mourn and process what's happening if they're not part of the whole sort of ceremony of death? Certainly the fewer ceremonies we have, I'm sure Butler would argue that the less able we will be to process death and understand it, or think about our own mortality and prepare for it properly, which is something we've all got to do at some point. But a lot of people just put it off and put it off and put it off, and then they're dead and they've not had a chance to think about what that means, how that will impact people left behind. So it is not prepared for. She does make a point in one of her articles that certainly in, well, she's talking about America, but Britain as well. It was until quite recently very common to have the body at the wake, and for relatives to be in contact with the dead body. Whereas these days, of course, it's more common. You phone up the funeral parlour, they turn up, they carve the body off, and you don't see it until the actual burial or cremation, and sometimes not even then if it's sealed. And so there's no sort of immediate involvement with the actual cause, which for some people, I'm sure, is you think that the fact that they don't know what to do about it. But her argument is that back in the day, and I'm sure it still is in many parts of the world, much more common, if you see your relative, your friend, stretched out there, maybe you come to terms with it, you help prepare the corpse, you put the clothes on it, ready to go coffin or whatever. It is a process. And rather than being a horrifying thing, it's actually a good thing.
Rather than just being something over in your mind that you couldn't quite get over.
Yes. And there are some people who never quite get it into their head that somebody's dead.
Yes.
Perhaps because they've not seen the body.
Yes.
There is an argument that I've heard made several times in America, going back to the war people, that America has this predilection for funerals involving embalming fluid and trying to make the body look as alive as they can. So you can do a course, a certificate in cosmetics for a funeral.
So they lie there but looking healthy.
Yes, all painted up.
Oh wow.
Which
You've heard of, like, when someone died, some people say they wish they hadn't seen them in a funeral home because they'd rather remember how they were. But fate.
But they might get over that. They might get over that sort of part and then come to terms with it.
No, my mum saw her dad and she wished she'd never had. I saw my stepdad and I wish I never had.
You do?
Yeah.
Even though now you know that he isn't here.
No, it just didn't feel the same. I knew he was dying and he was dying for quite a while. So I'd already processed that. I knew it wasn't just instant with either of them. But yeah, watching someone dying, their features change and everything.
Yeah.
And you've already come to terms with that. But then seeing them in a funeral home, yes, it is an end as such, but I'd love to just remember how he was.
As he was, even if he was ill.
Yeah.
But still alive.
I suppose it'd be different if it was a tragedy and I hadn't had that time to process that they were ill, they were dying, and there was going to be an end to it as such. But no, even my mum, when her dad was dying, she wished that she'd never seen him either.
Oh, okay. Well, you don't know how you feel.
No, I
don't know how you feel yourself. You listen to your experience, but you don't know how you feel yourself.
No. Each to their own. It's the way of processing it, isn't it?
Yes.
Like I said, it may have been different if it was an instant or quick death, but both of them wasn't. It was quite drawn out. Right. So we'd already.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that was.
Eye-opening,
It's very, very interesting.
Not curious.
No.
Thank you very much, Robin.
Pleasure. Are you?
Are you zooming out to people as well?
Yes.
Right.
Okay. Teams rather than Zoom, but yeah, same thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Are you doing more funerals lately, Anita, or?
Yes, I've done a couple. Yes, it's not so well. It's something. It's funny, isn't it? Going to the back, looking at somebody that's just died. I always think that they look very peaceful, and there's a sense that whatever you believe, they are no longer in their body, but they're elsewhere. There's a change that happens. That their essence or whatever your soul, whatever you believe, is no longer there, and there is a sense of coming to an end, a closure.
Yes. I do think a lot of people, as you say, increasingly struggle to come to terms with that, perhaps because of changing funeral customs.
And we're sterilising death. We're medicalising end of life, keeping people alive longer, but diminishing their quality of life. And I think that affects how we think about death as well.
Yes. Having tubes poked in everywhere for yes. Not a pleasant prospect. I think also maybe the sense that, as you say, it's medicalised because people tend to more people die in hospital now than die in their own home, where a few generations ago they would have been at home being cared for and died at home, rather than die in a hospital with tubes.
Absolutely.
Anyway,
I'm sorry, I've got to go.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Take care. Bye.
Bye bye. Turn the recording. Oh, it's up.